Okay. John, do you want to go up there? Just tell her to stay with this because you're showing your slides. Oh, but that's nice. I don't know, Mitch. I could sit here while looking at your screensaver. Great. Well, good evening, everyone. And thank you. Thank you. I'll try. With a little help from our friends in the control booth. Welcome to the October talk in the SDForum, a distinguished speaker series co-hosted by the Computer History Museum, the ACM San Francisco Bay Area chapter, and the Chinese Software Professionals Association. I'm Sandy Rockowitz, co-host, or co-chair, I should say, along with Vibo White of the series. SDForum, as most of you probably know, is an organization of some 2,000 software professionals, both technical and business oriented. Our premier sponsors include Microsoft, Sun, BEA, IBM, Oracle, and the city of San Jose. Our aim, simply put, is to be your best source of information, both about the technical and the business aspects of the software industry. To this end, we have over a dozen SIGs that meet monthly on topics ranging from all the way from bioinformatics to XML. And we also host another 10 or so special events each month, including this series. If you're not already a member, I'd encourage you to consider joining. It gives you discounted access or free access to all of our events, and also discounted access to a lot of other industry events such as trade shows and conferences. So that there's a lot to be had in this organization, and if you're not familiar with this organization, welcome. By the way, I should ask, how many people here, this is the first time they've been to an SDForum event? Wow. Okay, I guess I wasn't preaching to the converted. Welcome. Speaking of special events, I want to let you know about two special events that are coming up. Next week, Thursday, October 30th, is the SDForum 20th anniversary party. Would you believe it? This organization and its predecessors have been around for 20 years, and that's almost as long as Lotus 123. So we're going to be having a big party at SDForum's offices in San Jose, and that will go on from 4 till 9 p.m. We're going to have remarks by Mayor Ron Gonzalez of San Jose, Ann Winblad of Hummer Winblad, and co-chair of our board of directors, Dan O'Lewin of Microsoft, who's also on the board of directors, and James Gosling, Sun Fellow and Vice President. And we'll also be having a little ceremony formally contributing SDForum's archives to the Computer History Museum. The second special event that I want to let you know about is coming up in early December. The exact date has not yet been set. But we're going to be having a day-long seminar and expo focusing on open source. And there will be two tracks, one focusing on business aspects of open source and another on the more technical aspects of open source. There will be vendor demonstrations. So stay tuned to our website, www.sdforum.org, for further information. I'd like to take a few minutes to acknowledge some of the organizations and people who make this series possible. In particular, we're delighted to have three organizations co-hosting this series with us. The Computer History Museum, the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the ACM, and the Chinese Software Professionals Association. John Toole is the executive director of the Computer History Museum, and John has a few words to say. Okay, we'll see if...
Let me begin by saying that it's a real It's a real honor and pleasure here. To be in this particular group. The SDForum is really special to us, even though we're at the Computer History Museum. We like to I characterize myself as a 25-year-old company. Basically, we're now a real nonprofit startup. And we've really had a real rich history. Let me see. Let me put this into mode here, Sandy.
Oh.
Yes? That's it? Okay. We just purchased a new building here in Mountain View, but our history goes back 25 years to Digital Equipment Corporation and Boston Computer Museum. Our mission is to preserve the artifacts and stories of the information age, and we have the largest collection in the world. And that includes software, hardware, networking artifacts. We have some big hunks of iron now. We're just starting with our alpha phase, and that's kind of where we are right now. Our alpha phase has a nice little exhibit over there. I hope you folks can come and visit us sometime. It has a visible storage we just opened up in June. So the last year has really been putting a lot of this stuff together in our out-year plan for about the next 5 years. We have a great auditorium. Even this evening, as we speak, we sort of had a conflict. We have one of our museum fellows. With the Museum Fellows is an award that we give to honored people for the lifelong contribution. Mitch Kapor, by the way, is one of our museum fellows back in 1996. And David Wheeler we honored this week, and he is speaking over at Microsoft. But this is success, I think, and shows the kind of people that we have involved together. And I think I've seen Sandy and Laura and Bevo more times this week than I have for the last 2 years. And our future, however, is really to make it very interactive, make it robust, but very, very authentic, and put together with a research component that we're really going to be proud of now and in the future. So come visit us if you like. We've got a series of lecturers coming up, which complements what we've been doing with the SDForum in our co-hosting. These are the 3 fellows. Tim Berners-Lee, who spoke last evening. Gordon Bell was the 3rd fellow for this particular year. And, what can you do? Get engaged, volunteer with the SDForum, volunteer with us. There's lots of opportunities as we're describing what software is and how that can be presented. That's going to be a large focus for us for the next year to see how this is all going to come together. And we really look for your artifacts and stories. Don't throw them away. Ask us first, please. There's so much being lost. And when you look 50 years in the future and you look back in this period of time when computing just sort of started and emerged and is everywhere, we want that story told authentically as we possibly can. So help us do that. Enjoy our lecture program, enjoy the SDForum's lecture program, and there's more literature out there. With that, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Great. We're also delighted that as of tonight's event, the ACM San Francisco Bay Area chapter has joined us as co-host of the series. Bob Fraley is chapter president, is it? Yes. And so Bob has a few words to say.
Well, first, I want to say that we're proud that the ACM has also now become a sponsor of this series. So we see this as a very influential series. We've been around in the Bay Area for about 35 years, and we host talks roughly once a month, and once or twice a year we have full-day seminars. The National ACM puts out a whole host of publications. You may know them. There's some flyers sitting out front that will show you our upcoming lectures. The one coming up right now in November is NASA's Mars Exploration Rovers and the Collaborative Information Portal by 3 of the researchers from NASA Ames. And then in January, we'll have a talk on Dreamweaver user interface development. So we try to give talks that are on current types of technology, current things that are happening in the industry, and things of that sort. Once again, just like everybody else is saying, get involved, help us create, find the right kinds of speakers to keep our membership informed of what's happening and what's important in the changing scene. So, let's get going.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.
also want to acknowledge some of the people who make this series possible. Bibo White, as I mentioned, is co-chair of the series. There's also our program committee, Alex Chan, Chuck Berg, Bill Grasso, and Matt Grasek. And those of you, I'm not sure, Bibo, I see Bibo, I saw Matt, sort of stand up and let people know who you are. And but before you sit down, I had an ulterior motive in asking you guys to stand up. Because we really want your feedback on this series and want to hear from you as to what you think we're doing right, what we could do better. So after the talk, grab any one of us and give us your comments. And in particular, I'd very much like to know what people thought of having the music for the networking hour. Was that a good idea? Okay. Was that, did anybody think it made it hard to talk and it was not such a good idea? Great. Thank you. And let us know. And if you have some more candid comments, again, we'd want to hear about those as well. And more generally, I want to say that SDForum's strength is really its volunteers. And their knowledge and their dedication have enabled SDForum to be an integral part of Silicon Valley for the past 20 years. And if there are SIG chairs and other volunteers in the audience who want to sort of stand up and we can sort of give you our thanks. No? Great, I see one back there. Okay. Janice? I think we have a lot of shy volunteers here. Okay. Well, now on to the more formal part of the program. The SDForum Distinguished Speaker Series presents people whose leadership and creativity have advanced the state of the art in software development. People who've helped us understand how software is created and also understand its role in the society as a whole. The theme for the 2003-2004 series of talks is As Computing is Everywhere. This year, we're exploring the changes, challenges, and opportunities confronting both software developers and the larger society as software's creation, implementation, and use become widely dispersed technologically, dispersed organizationally, and dispersed geographically. Some talks in this series will emphasize the underlying technologies, and others the social impact of these changes. We'll consider how these developments foster new kinds of applications, new forms of social organization, and how these changes also enable us to revisit old problems in new and novel ways. Our speaker tonight is Mitch Kapor, and to introduce him, we have Brian Bellendorf, who is CTO and founder and CTO, I guess is the proper way of putting it, of CollabNet, which creates an infrastructure for collaborative software development. And also, before that, founder and president of the Apache Software Foundation. Brian?
Thank you. I don't normally write up notes for a presentation, but I figured I wanted to get it right this time. So when I was growing up in the 70s and early 80s, I kind of saw computer science as a dismal science, kind of a close cousin to accounting almost. My dad worked at IBM, and even though we had a TRS-80 around the house and I was fine with BASIC and stuff, still all those stacks of punch cards that we would use for shopping lists or whatever just did nothing to interest me in wanting to pursue that as a career. Current events interested me a lot more, and I didn't see, sitting there writing COBOL programs to help some bean counter as a way to actually change society or have any sort of impact out there. Even having logo around and Macintoshes and stuff at my schools and things didn't really help. They seemed to me almost like a cruel trick, like a little piece of candy to lure young people into careers that had them feeding big mainframes and loading the green and white printer paper into printers. That to me wasn't really what I wanted to do with my life. There's only 2 industries in the world that call their customers users, and I didn't want to be one of those. And I don't think my experience was all that unique at that time either. I think a lot of people also couldn't quite conceptualize the PC revolution in the early days, at least, as something that ended up being as democratic and as powerful as it was. Mitch Kapor had a lot to do with this. He made his first assault on this paradigm in 1982 when he co-founded Lotus and co-wrote 123 with Jonathan Sachs, right? Jonathan Sachs. In addition to garnering critical acclaim for 123, within 2 years the company had gotten $156 million in revenue from the sales of 123. That's incredible. That's something that you don't really hear even today much about, right? And it was a commercial success, partly because I think it was a social success. It was one of the first applications that really made non-programmers able to deal with complex data and complex algorithms and to do it in a way that was actually useful, right? Up to that point, it had been word processors and writing basic programs. His next move against this paradigm was co-founding the Electronic Frontier Foundation in 1990. And the internet revolution at that time hadn't quite begun. You had BBSs, you had Prodigy and CompuServe, but I think he and the others that he brought together saw that the spread of ubiquitous networks, the spread of ubiquitous technologies, were going to bring about a set of changes that people weren't really prepared for. And even if it was hard to describe what the EFF was really going to be about in 1990, there's no doubt of its relevancy today with the DMCA and with the other activities going on. Many would probably compare Mitch to somebody like a Bill Gates or a Steve Jobs in terms of the early commercial successes he's had. But I see him in a whole different league, a league more like Vannevar Bush, people technologists who understand that the point of technology shouldn't be about having a faster CPU or a fancier GUI, but should be about trying to improve society. For the last decade, Mitch has worked towards this goal by being an advocate for open networks and open systems, writing articles for the press, testifying in front of Congress, investing in companies that he believed would further this goal. 2 years ago, we founded the Open Source Applications Foundation, which I'm sure he's going to talk about more. And on Saturday, he will be the recipient of the Norbert Weiner Award from the Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility, one of many awards that he's won over the course of his career. In my view, Mitch has helped make software programming as a profession a humanist endeavor. I don't think it really was that, up through the 70s and through the 80s. I think he really helped software programmers think about what they do in the most broad context possible, which is, how is what I'm doing going to have an impact on society? That's something that open source developers think a lot more about than I think people give them credit for. They believe they're writing something that's going to improve society by giving it away, right? And I think Mitch helped plant many of the seeds that led to this kind of conception. So please help me welcome Mitch Kapor.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. That was nice. So one of the great things about being invited to speak here at SDForum is I can really let out my inner geek. So I have my camera here, and I'm just going to take a little snapshot. There you go. This will be up on my blog later. One of the things that Brian didn't mention about my career, I have trouble keeping a job. And in 1999, I relocated from Boston, where I'd been for more than 25 years, to the Bay Area, which is a long-standing dream of mine, a dream deferred. And I took up for a spell as a professional venture capitalist. And my subsequent career in open source is really an attempt to atone for the sins that I accumulated. I should also say Lotus was a very long time ago, and I can no longer do technical support questions for 123, but I do have Ray Ozzy's home phone number if anybody has questions about notes or groove and would like to make a small contribution to OSAF. So. Well, what I thought I would do tonight is to try to give you some perspective on open source, where it has been and where I think it's going. And I just want to dive right into that. Now, I should explain one thing. I've been on the road for a week. I was in Indianapolis, New York, Cambridge for 2 nights, New Haven, Cambridge again, and Los Angeles, and I'm back. And so the slides for this are just-in-time slides. Frida, my wife, drove us down, us being the 2 of us and our 2 dogs, Cosmo and Chandler. And while we were in the dog park at 5:30, I finished the slides. So anybody who spots a typo, please, be gentle. So open source, to me, is really still surprising in how successful it's been, especially considering where it started. I can tell you my first impression, my first memory of Richard Stallman, who really is the founder of, he would say, free software. We now say open source. Because when I met Richard, it was when he was picketing the Lotus building in the mid-1980s, leading a group of protesters about a small matter of look and feel. And to give Richard credit, he was more correct about that than I thought at the time. I was just really deeply, deeply divided about about the appropriateness of Lotus pursuing look and feel lawsuits. And in fact, this was during the time I was exiting. And I can remember I was sick in bed, and I was board chair, no longer the CEO, and we had to vote on whether to sue. It wasn't Borland, it was the other people before that. And I did that and immediately regretted it and have regretted it sort of forever. But Richard was leading a group of picketers and living under his desk at the AI lab. I mean, he was a kind of 20th century equivalent of the 19th century anarchist or Bolshevik who was seized in the grip of an ideology of free software and was setting out single-handedly to remake the world of software in that image. And I looked at this and I thought, interesting, but even with the MacArthur grant, I thought pretty marginal. And in fact, free software, and the Free Software Foundation, had a kind of slow growth in a narrow segment of the world through the 80s and into the early 90s. And the other paradigmatic figure, of course, is Linus Torvalds, who is just in extreme contrast to Richard, who adopted most of the methodology of free software in order to pursue what was a passionate interest, which was to create an operating system. And I think it is fair to call the result GNU Linux, which is the way I refer to it here, because without Richard Stallman and GNU Linux would not have happened. So without Richard, there wouldn't have been open source. And in fact, with him, there almost wasn't open source. And I think this was really the key breakthrough when the tone of projects began to shift from ideological to pragmatic, and licenses changed the nature of the licenses. And almost all of a sudden, after a long incubation through the mid-90s and into the late 90s, open source projects all of a sudden blossomed and flowered and became important to the rest of the world in a way that was, I think, shocking from the point of view, let's say, of the typical MIS or IT director. So I can imagine some of the first conversations. So in that time period, and the IT director is interviewing somebody, says, so you want to install this software, and nobody owns it. or in fact controls it. In fact, you don't even know who works on this, or if in fact this code that you want to run is actually, not somebody else's and that it's stolen, and that there's nobody in charge. But you're telling me that this is better quality software and it's free. This is like completely crazy. And from that perspective, I think it really defied conventional wisdom, that you could coordinate a large body of developers without centralized control or direction, and yet produce a work that was, for particular purposes, superior in its category to the other alternatives, such that people started installing very large numbers of Linux servers and Apache, which Brian was significantly responsible for, really almost not caring how it was made, or maybe it would be better to say, willing to overlook its rather odd heritage at first. And then I think people came to understand, as we'll see, that the open source form, there, we have power again, had some unique advantages, in fact, for certain uses over more conventional methods of development. But that's getting a little bit ahead of the story. But certainly, if you had gone to anybody in the software industry in the 80s or into the 90s and predicted what the future would be like, they would have laughed at you just every bit as much as they laughed at the people in the early 80s who said that PCs were going to become ubiquitous and take over. So that the successes of open source fall into different categories. I think in the language area, actually, with Perl and Python and PHP, all of which are open source projects, are just coming into their own now. Tim O'Reilly told me that they track cumulative sales of books by language, so that they track all their Java titles and all their C and C++ titles. And the fastest growing segment of their language books in the past 6 months has been Python. And we have also at Open Source Applications Foundation put a big bet on Python. And in fact, the successes even have begun to extend into the area of applications with projects like OpenOffice and Mozilla. And I'll tell you something, in the US, I don't know what OpenOffice's penetration is because Microsoft still has a stranglehold on the market. But in the rest of the world, distribution of OpenOffice is enormous. If it's not in the tens of millions, it's certainly in the millions of copies, because it is good enough for the purposes that people want to use it for, and it's free. And it's making dramatic inroads. So what is it? What's the secret sauce? And my conclusion, having looked at a lot of projects, is that there are a few characteristics that really give open source its character. It's fundamentally a different way to organize the work of doing development. There's transparency, and that means that obviously the source code is available to all and sundry. And that actually has a number of interesting implications. One thing that Linus says is, with enough eyes, all bugs are shallow. And that's because enough people looking at the code can more easily figure out what the problems are. It also leverages, open source also leverages, I call the Bill Joy principle. Bill said, in a company, sooner or later, you find out that most of the smart people in the world don't work for you. And there's something interesting going on in the search space now. I have a great deal of respect for Google. I'm a fanatically happy user of Google. And they have done a great job in providing gainful employment for PhDs in the search area. I don't know how many hundreds of them they've hired, but it's a large number. But I'm also, in addition to using Google, on the board of an open source project called Notch, which is doing a open source search engine, very high quality. And I was just at the first board meeting, and they already have contributions from Albania and various places in Southeast Asia of people who have just downloaded the code and who have started adding things and patching things and making extensions. And it turns out that there are a lot of smart people who are interested and know how to work on search who, in fact, are not part of the cadre at Google. Open source projects are very distributed. And in fact, without the internet, open source would not really be possible. The only way to coordinate the efforts of a large number of people is through a ubiquitous worldwide kind of network. And there's an interesting academic paper by a law professor named Yochai Benkler, who is applying tools of classical economic analysis to try to explain where some of the power of open source comes from. And one of his observations is that, in fact, you could argue that it has lower coordination costs because it kind of works by people just showing up or volunteering or coming to the site, identifying things that they're interested in. When you have a project that is accessible to anyone in a community of potentially millions of developers, it turns out, not all the time, but some of the time, it's easier to get the things done that need to be done by virtue of volunteers showing up than in a centralized way of hiring people to do things, even if you're not bound, resource bound. I put a question mark about after the word voluntary, because this is one of the most interesting and phenomena that is in a kind of transition. I mean, obviously, going back to the origins of open source, and as Eric Raymond famously observed in the Cathedral and the Bazaar, a lot of open source projects start because programmers want to scratch their own itch, and they can then often or sometimes find other people who are interested in that, and projects kind of aggregate the successful ones by more and more people joining them. But obviously, perhaps not obviously, there might seem to be a kind of a scaling problem, since most people actually have to work for a living. And if open source relied exclusively on voluntary efforts, I think that would impose a constraint. The other week, Brian and I were at a workshop together, and he cited an interesting statistic, which I checked with him and stands behind, as to how much things have changed. But in Apache, taking all of the projects, today, about 80% of the people who contribute to that are paid by their employers to do so. That, to me, was a very striking statistic and reflects, for that project, which is relatively mature, a very different state of affairs, that it is kind of moved into the mainstream, and it's no longer relying on volunteer efforts, but lots of companies have, for a variety of reasons, and I'll come back to this, decided it's strategic for them to have people working on those projects. I think that the Apache number is pretty high, but anecdotally, I think it's not. I think it's reasonable to say that there's very significant corporate support and sponsorship for many of the successful ongoing projects. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about free software. I got a call, email actually, from a reporter at Forbes magazine. Forbes, as you know, is a kind of self-styled bastion of free enterprise. And it was clear that they were in the process of doing a debunking story on free software. I don't know if it's come out yet or not. And that critique, which one hears in lots of places, basically is, this can't possibly work because there's no such thing as free lunch. And sooner or later, somebody has to pay for this stuff. And so let's just get over it. And I think Stallman, to his credit, has long distinguished a couple of senses of freedom. There's sort of free as in beer, and then there's free as in freedom. And he's been pretty clear that he meant the latter, not the former. And that I think that that is, I think that that's right, that what makes open source is not, in fact, that the software is free or that it is costless to have it, but it is the freedom that comes from the ability to get a hold of the source code and take a project in different directions. And when you get on a global scale and multiply the effects, it's kind of like, water running downhill to fill, spread out over the horizon. And there's some very interesting styles of business operation that are beginning to emerge that I wanted to mention here, because it's my belief that people are going to attempt to, as I'm virtually certain this Forbes article will do, debunk open source by saying this is free software and it can't possibly work. There's a different mentality that's at work in some of the commercial companies that are building on open source. So if you take a company, a new company I just met, German, called OGO, Open Groupware, what's the final O for? It'll come back to me, sorry about that. I just think of them as OGO. They've done a groupware server that started out in life as a proprietary product. And they came to the conclusion that they would actually be better served by open sourcing that particular project and doing contract work for clients, and this is typically mid-sized banks and other institutions that wanted it adapted for their particular installation, or have extensions made, or do something with that code base. And they've in fact been doing quite nicely with it. And it's a bit, I think, odd from a Silicon Valley perspective, because there's no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for these guys. They don't have the idea that they're going to start a software company and raise venture capital and then make a product and generate enough in the way of business and excitement, or whatever the currency of the day is, to have a public offering by which the founders can then cash out. They're interested in making a living and doing good work. And what's interesting is that for them, this is a kind of a no-brainer choice. The same thing with the people from MySQL, which has, it's a terrific relational database with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of installations. The cost for their licenses, because it's not completely free, is somewhere between 0.1% and 10% of the corresponding Oracle installation. And they're doing quite nicely economically, and expanding and paying their developers and running a business. And what makes it possible in a way, and again, it may be because they're European and there's something different in the water there, but they're quite happy doing that. They're not attempting to cash in a big kind of way. Although, and this is something that I continue to watch for signs of, they took a venture capital investment from Benchmark recently, $18 million, perhaps maybe a year ago. And so it may be that Benchmark is betting that there's a huge business to be made out of it. So the last chapter is not being written. But the point that I want to make here is that there are companies that are doing quite nicely, building on top of open source in a variety of ways, and I'll circle back to this. But they're a different kind of company. So peering into my crystal ball, I tried to sort of figure out a little bit about what might be happening in the future. And my conclusion is that the barriers to entry for people doing open source projects are extremely low. And it is, as I said, like flowing water. Where open source software, OSS, can go, it will go simply because somewhere in this wide world of ours there's a programmer or a group of programmers who are undertaking to do a particular project. So I don't, and we can see open source kind of crawling up the stack from lower level up to higher levels, from systems to applications. And I don't think that there's really any completely protected territory. I do think that there's some high ground, though. So the more kind of application-specific enterprise software you're doing, the more mission critical that is, and the more specific it is to particular lines of business, the less likely there's going to be an open source alternative, because it's harder to do. People may be less motivated to do it. But it's, that's not an absolute, that's relative. And I think, and this is just speculation, again, not particularly informed by facts, that somebody is going to figure out that an open source general ledger package for businesses would be a very good thing, particularly in this post-Enron, post-WorldCom era. The idea that a company's books and financial records might be based on software, the source code of which is available to anybody, could be very interesting, could actually be very attractive, because one could imagine third parties actually being able to freely develop certain types of analytical tools to look at, companies' books that might actually make the companies look good if their books are all in order. And having open source accounting, just to pick one idea, could lead to more transparency for the businesses themselves, and transparency in business is enjoying a renaissance. We've seen there's lots of open source in the game world, and what we're doing at Open Source Applications Foundation is a move into the application space. This isn't an OSAF talk or a Chandler talk, but if people have questions during the Q&A, I'm more than happy to tell you what is up with it. So, challenges. I don't think that the future is predetermined. And even if it were, I certainly wouldn't be able to tell you what it was. But I think from the open source advocacy point of view, there are a couple of big questions to ask. And from the impact on the rest of the world and people who are in the software industry and not doing open source, there's a big question, not yet on this slide. And that's really what I want to focus on. So one big question is, can open source sustain itself? Is it a flash in the pan? What's going to keep projects, around for the long term? I've already mentioned one important factor, which is that there is increasing amounts of corporate support for key projects. And it goes to show that open source doesn't have to produce revenue. It just has to be strategically important. So if what IBM does with open source is good for the parts of the business where they have things to sell, then they're going to do that. And that is, in fact, what they're doing. This is not particularly good news for software entrepreneurs, and don't get me wrong, but it can be good for an IBM. Borland has actually taken a big step in this direction, and they have a new line of compilers and IDEs and so on based on the WX Windows GUI toolkit, which is an open source project. And so we're seeing a shift in the funding base. Not only is there corporate money, but there are some, I would call them noble experiments in other funding sources, which we have to see if they prove out or not. But in our own case at OSAF, we started out to build a simple personal information manager that worked on a peer-to-peer basis. We were kind of targeting small groups, either on an ad hoc basis or within larger organizations, but we weren't thinking, we were in fact avoiding the whole issue of what we were going to do about moving Chandler to a 500 or 5,000 person organization. We were deferring it. It's a hard problem. No one wants to compete with Microsoft, who is sane. And the fun parts of the design could be done, just aiming at individuals and small groups. But something very interesting happened last October, which is when we put up our website, which is it attracted interest from unexpected quarters. And in our case, it was from higher education. Universities, and in particular their central computing organizations, who were really feeling a big void in terms of how well they were being served with messaging software and collaboration, and particularly calendaring software. I mean, a big research university could be 30, 40, 50,000 people. They have lots of different, everything from a university-wide event calendar to needs for doing the kinds of scheduling that are done in enterprises. And they were feeling very poorly served by the existing commercial alternatives, which are basically Microsoft, IBM, and Oracle. But they were very interested in an open source solution. Open source is very congruent with the ways universities operate. And in fact, what happened was a plan to develop a version of Chandler that will directly serve higher education that is being co-funded by a university consortium of 25 schools and by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, which focuses on support of higher education. This is a $3 million grant almost over 2.5 years. So it's a very substantial, it's the largest commitment of that type that I'm aware of. And in a way, the customers are funding the product. But it is open source, freely available. They are our development partners because they've committed technical resources from their organizations. And we're talking, Berkeley and Stanford and MIT and Carnegie Mellon, that level of school. Now we have to deliver the product that they're happy with. So the onus is on us. As I said, it's a kind of a noble experiment. But part of the reason that the Mellon Foundation, which really took the initiative in bringing us all together, why they were interested in doing this is if it works, it can be a model for other kinds of development projects of this sort of collaborative funding where everybody kicks in a little bit of money. And I know that if it works, there are any number of other projects that could be done this way. And I guarantee without open source, there's no way that any of these universities would be willing to commit to that. And so there are new things happening in the economics of open source. The last point I want to make about the sustainability has to do with the emergence of new kinds of licenses. Open source licenses are incredibly complex. They're Talmudic in their complexity and in the willingness of people to argue about the proper interpretation of licenses. The simple point that I want to make here is that we're still in a period of productive experimentation. I don't believe that one size fits all when it comes to licenses. I don't think at the end of the day the GPL is going to triumph, nor do I think that the GPL is going to be vanquished. I think different kinds of licenses will be appropriate for different situations. And in particular, I think we're going to see hybrid licenses that have a kind of a dual character, where a product is available under more than one license depending on the purpose to which you put it. Sleepy Cat Software, which does Berkeley DB, which is in very widespread usage, has this type of license, as does MySQL. And we at OSAF are planning to do that. And the way we're planning to approach the licensing is as follows, which says, look, if you take the code and you create a derivative work, you add anything to it and you redistribute it as those changes, as long as you redistribute the source code, then there's no fee, no charge. That's basically the GPL. On the other hand, because we want to encourage people to build commercial products on top of our code base, if you take the code and you create a derivative work and you don't contribute the changes back, then you obtain the code under a commercial license for which there's a fee. It will be, as these things go, compared with flat-out commercial licenses, a modest fee, because we're simply trying to generate enough revenue coming back in that will help support our continuing core development of 15 or 20 or 30 developers. Our cost structure is quite a bit simpler than what you would find in a commercial firm. And I should say, we're a nonprofit, and we chose to do that not because we think everybody should be a nonprofit, hardly, but because as a nonprofit, if we get licensing revenues back in, they can't go into anybody's pocket. They have to be contributed towards the mission of the organization itself. And that kind of virtuous circle, we hope, again, another experiment, will be enough to convince volunteer contributors that it's worthwhile making contributions to what we're doing, even though not everybody who uses the code is putting their changes back in. You're either putting your changes back in or you're putting money in. And if you put money in, that is funding more core development, which is available to everyone. So we have concept tested this quite extensively. So far, so good. But we'll see in practice what actually happens, where OSAF is an interesting collection of experiments. But my belief is that the underlying advantages of lower cost development and higher quality will, in lots of segments, make open source very attractive, and the economic models will develop around them. I can't tell you whether I think that's going, how quickly it's going to spread and how ubiquitous it is going to become. How quickly, I don't know. I've always been terrible at these kinds of predictions. Paul Sappho is fond of saying that people are terrible at predicting things and tend to simultaneously make two mistakes when there's a new phenomenon. They overestimate the short-term impact and they underestimate the long-term impact. And I think, certainly with the personal computer and with the internet, we had perfect examples of overestimating. The internet changes everything. Well, not quite, but I think in the long term, the impact is going to be enormous. So I'm pretty bullish on the sustainability issue. Then there's the innovation issue, and I think this is a very fair observation that successful open source projects, by and large, have proceeded by re-engineering in a better way an existing design for something. I mean, Linux is Unix. Apache is another web server. And Mozilla is an open source standards compliant browser. And OpenOffice is a slightly kinder and gentler version of Office. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong. I think, in fact, it is quite useful and admirable to implement an open source project that simply does a good job engineering over a feature set that already exists, that is in widespread use. Nothing wrong with that, but if that's all open source does, where's the innovation going to come from? Where are the new products going to come from? Where are the things that Moore's Law continues to make possible? Where are those projects going to come from? Now, I have to say, in many ways, they're not coming from the commercial sector, at least in, given the continuance of the desktop monopoly in Windows and Office. There's been dramatically little innovation, at least available to most people, in the spaces controlled there. But that's a separate issue. Just because it's not happening there doesn't mean it's going to happen in open source. In my own case, I will tell you, I was kind of directed initially. Open source made a transition for me more than a couple of years ago now, from being an object of intellectual curiosity to being something to really place a bet on, when my frustration over software grew to a kind of a terminal level. Just personally, using the products that I had available to me to use was frustrating in my own experience, and I had lots of design ideas for great, I thought, productivity applications and things that could be done, knowing full well that, trying to raise money a venture capitalist would have to be crazy to invest, because you just could not make the case that the chances of success would be sufficiently high to warrant the investment. And in fact, that's why there isn't a lot of innovation. But the straw that broke the camel's back for me on this actually had to do with an experience not of mine, but of my wife. So Frida is sitting here in the front row, and she has a small consulting business dealing with workplace issues of bias, harassment, discrimination. She does training and surveys. She's on the road a lot. She's got lots of clients. There are some other people that work in the office. And, well, I should say, we worked together at Lotus 20 years ago, but we were not married. She was the director of employee relations. We got together as a couple 7.5 years ago, so it's like 1996. And in addition to getting together as a couple, I also became the first responder for tech support issues in her consulting business. So, and I know that some of you wind up having similar roles with your significant others, or maybe with your parents, or with friends, and so on. It's what happens. And they were still doing scheduling with faxes and voicemail. And I said, this is nuts. You need some sort of calendar program that you can all use to keep track of things, because there's very complicated calendars. And I went and did a bunch of research, because I wasn't particularly familiar with the segment. And much to my horror, I wound up recommending that they buy and install an Exchange server. This had to be hard for me. But I looked at it, and I looked at what the requirements were, and given that set of requirements, even though it was massive overkill for a 4-person office to buy a new piece of hardware, an NT server license, an Exchange license, and about 50 hours of the guy to do the magic Harry Potter incantations over the thing to get it to work, there wasn't at that time a practical alternative. And that server is still running today, although its days are numbered. I would say it's got less than 9 months before it switches to Chandler, or I die trying. But the point is, I said, there just has to be a better way here. It seems to me, if you've got a small group of people and they're just trying to do something simple, like I want to look at your calendar and you want to look at my contacts, you shouldn't have to make that level of investment. And in fact, it's really, in a way, not the Design Center for Exchange, as well as Notes, is the 500-person and up organization. They're not aiming at the 5-person organization. Nobody is. And in fact, it's not particularly economic to do that in conventional terms. But that's when the light started to go off in my head. I said, well, it would be perfectly possible to do a product that uses some peer-to-peer technology that actually lets people easily share their personal information. And that was the genesis of the idea for Chandler. And it only made sense to do it on an open source basis because of the enormous traction, the enormous, leverage that you get. If it could get some initial traction, this is the bet that we placed, some adoption, both by end users and developers, then it's a rolling snowball. That's what's happened with the successful projects. And we decided to take some risks and try to do the redesign from the ground up in terms of rethinking the personal information manager, contacts, calendar, email, especially email, because of the high volume of email that people have today, and the fact that many people live their lives out of their inbox, and that the tools that we use to do email, not to single any one particular one out, really weren't designed to carry the kind of workload that we asked them to. And they weren't designed in a way that really nicely integrates the different kinds of data that you have. The email, the events on your calendar, your tasks, the notes you've made, the documents that you have. But the observation I would make is that when people work, they're typically working in the context of a particular project. They're not, which means the information relating to that project, if it's kept in these vertically separated silos, email here, documents there, bookmarks, in the browser, that's not going to work very well. And so that seemed to justify a rethink about taking a much more integrated approach. So another one of the dimensions in which OSAF is experimenting and taking risks is trying to do something innovative. If it works, I think it will be a model. It says it can be done. You just need to get the right set of people together with the right skills. And I actually am increasingly bullish that we'll certainly produce something innovative and useful. I can't guarantee what the adoption is going to be. But these are challenges. They're big challenges for open source. And the whole movement could run out of gas or sputter if projects can't sustain themselves and if there isn't innovation within the open source space itself. And I have already covered these points, so we're going to skip that. Oh, what happened to my last slide? This is what happens when you do your slides in the dog park. I've covered this. I've covered this. No, I just forgot to move forward. This is the slide I wanted to get to, because I know that this is what's on a number of people's minds, because I've had these conversations with several of my friends who are developers, and bemoan the death of the startup dream and blame open source for it, saying, how are we going to make money? How are we going to start companies and get paid for it? And so I want to pose the question, is the startup dream over? And look at it through a particular lens. So I have to just divert for a couple minutes from open source. I was out here during the boom and bust, and I think it has had deeply demoralizing effects of a long-term nature. Now, you might think that the demoralizing effects would come from the failure of so many companies, the enormous job losses, the sort of economic recession. And all of those things are real phenomena, and they are things to be genuinely upset and concerned about. But there's an additional thing that happened, which was that, in fact, the boom and subsequent bust actually produced a whole lot of winners, of people who made hundreds of millions of dollars, seemingly the embodiment of the startup dream of you do your startup and you raise your money and you go public and you cash out. But the common characteristic of all of these people is either that their timing was good, they were just lucky, or they were incredibly opportunistic and knew that they better sell out before the whole thing crashed. Because none of those people, and the San Jose Mercury News had a great chart of all the people who made, $100 million or more during the boom. None of them, their stocks are worth nothing. At current values, those people, would be packing groceries at the Safeway. No sustaining value was created. Wealth was created. There was this enormous wealth transfer to hundreds of people out of the system into people's pockets. But no value was created for everybody else. And in an ironic kind of way, I have to say, I think as we all want to believe that we're virtuous and we work hard. And yeah, well, when I made my money at Lotus, we actually created value. And I think about it and go, well, we charged $495 a copy for Lotus because we could. Nobody felt that their arm was being twisted, and then prices have come down since then. If we'd only been able to charge $50 a copy, the economics would be different, and I, in fact, probably wouldn't be here talking to you. It's all kind of arbitrary. And that's, in fact, I think the point that I want to make, that there has been, GRQ, by the way, is get rich quick, for those people who didn't catch the acronym. I really think, not entirely, but by and large, the days when in software you could do that are over. Not for everybody. There's still going to be some opportunities, and people are going to start things, and there'll be public offerings and so on. But what I'm getting at is that the software industry has really been driven by a kind of a mythology that's what it's really about. That's what you're supposed to be doing, or that's what the important people are doing, is they're starting companies and making a lot of money. And it's not open source which is killing that. I just think that was more a product of a frontier kind of era, and not an unmitigated good thing. The whole software industry has matured that lots of segments of society they have the software they're going to be using. It's not the same kind of opportunity, and the economics have gotten more rational. I think one of the things, and what I mean by that is, things shouldn't cost any more to produce than they need to cost. And if you can do a completely first-rate piece of software on an open source basis for 1/10 or 1/20th of the cost that it would otherwise be for society as a whole, that's actually a good thing, because people get the same value but spend a lot less, and they have more money to spend on other stuff. It is not particularly good for software developers who want to find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, because it's a shrinking of that opportunity space. And I would say it's a kind of we might at some point want to have a moment of silence, if my prediction is correct, that, probably Netscape was like the last, well, there's Google. So Google will at some point have just some enormous, anomalous public offering, of course. But the idea that it's a thing you could do and aspire to, I think people will start finding other kinds of dreams. And those people who want to make enormous fortunes will probably not be going into software as much, but they'll go into life sciences, or there'll be some huge new thing that all the 18-year-olds have figured out that we don't have a clue about. And so there'll still be those opportunities, but they'll have shifted. I don't think that the death of that myth, though, is really a bad thing, because open source, I think, is beginning to prove, and I gave you some of the examples earlier, that it's possible to make an honest living and have rewarding work and create useful, elegant products. And there are hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people doing that. Nobody has done a census. Nobody really knows kind of what the economic throw weight of open source is. It's a little project that I would like to see done. But there's certainly so much anecdotal evidence of that, and that unquestionably kind of vital economy, like real jobs and people making money off of open source, is happening and will continue to happen and is attracting people, but it's a different dream. And I think we kind of have a choice about the dreams that we pursue. And so I'll just leave you with the thought that there's lots of interesting opportunities in software and many more chapters to be written. But I'm hopeful that the heroes of the next generation and the people who attract the attention are not that crew of 100 that extracted all that money out of the system, but are people who contribute to society by creating useful and beautiful artifacts out of bits for everybody else to use. Thank you. You could take the video down, and you're going to moderate the...
I'll try.
Great.
With this audience, that can sometimes be a challenge. So we've got 2 microphones. We will take 1 question from each side. When you're done with your question, please pass it back to whoever is on your side of the aisle with the microphone. Don't grab it out of somebody else's hand. And so when you ask your question, also, since we're recording this, if you can sort of say who you are.
Hi, Mitch. My name is Steve Mizak, and my question is about a controversial subject in the Valley these days, it seems, is offshore outsourcing.
Right.
And wondering if you have a perspective on that from the open source side of things.
Offshore outsourcing. I have a perspective on it in general, and I have to think in real time about open source. I mean, obviously, that the kind of distributed development that open source does lends itself to very, very widespread geographic participation. In general, I've always found it a little bit puzzling why people feel there's kind of in a particular country there's a kind of a God-given right to protect the jobs. I mean, I'm sort of it is a reality that there are a lot of smart people all around the world, and the internet is empowering them to add value, and so there's kind of the pressure towards outsourcing is strong and irresistible. But the question is, can you somehow go further up the value chain here and do things that can't be, as well done other places? And I tend to think that's the case, but I'm not an expert. But the one prediction I make is I think we're going to see a lot of people who used to be complete free market people adopting protectionist stances because of the, relativistic self-interest.
Yes. So right here. Sorry. So my question is that if the individual software developer out there in the world doesn't want to work for a large corporation and he is contributing to an open source project, how does he make a living? Right now, there seems to be this vacuum of companies and individuals derive economic value from open source, and I don't have a problem with that. But if I'm contributing to open source and I'm spending 4 or 5 hours a day contributing to this project and fixing bugs, I'd like to make a living from it. How does the money, or if there is going to be money, flow from a company to an intermediary to me for fixing and supporting those things without some huge infrastructure like the open, like your organization?
It's not that huge. Well, so just to be empirical about it and look around, what actually happens is that people who are good at and who are major contributors to a particular project oftentimes get consulting revenue or do projects or have their development funded by a particular kind of customer, who's using that project. I mean, it's certainly true in the Python world that, and funding is tight there, but a number of the people who are key contributors to Python do that and either get paid for it directly or also do Python-based consulting work or Zope-based consulting work. So that's one model. You know, there's no free lunch, and I'm not sure that there ought to be a kind of a free lunch. Well, then we're in agreement.
Deriving economic value from something that I help produce,
Right.
shouldn't I get economic value in return so I can survive?
Well, so the way that IBMs and HPs and others do is they actually employ people and pay them to work on these open source projects. And those programmers have the satisfaction that their work is able to be used by people outside the corporation, not just inside. Now, if you choose to forego that opportunity, and I can understand why, as a matter of personal choice, one might not want to work for a big company. I mean, I concluded I had to be an entrepreneur the day I realized I was never going to be able to work for anybody again. And if I wanted to have food with my dinner, I was going to have to. But on the other hand, you know, if you don't want to do that, that's a choice, but choices have consequences. I mean, I go a step further and say that there is, and this is a completely different subject, but the whole idea that we live in a global economy dominated by multinational corporations with enormous power is something that many people, myself included, are not very happy about. And I would say that part of why there may be fewer choices for people in certain situations has to do with how global power is allocated. But that and $1.50 gets you on the subway. So I guess if one is unhappy about that and you have that view of things, then the thing to do is to figure out whether, in my words, capitalism can be saved from itself. But as I said, that's a completely different talk. But that's where I go, if I follow all the way through on your question. Yes?
Hi.
Ask me an easy one, please.
I hope. My name's Bijan. I was wondering what you thought, how the software monopolies, the incumbent software monopolies, would defend their position against open source. Say, Linux versus Windows. How about Outlook versus Chandler plus 5 years?
How will they do that?
Yeah.
Oh, they'll probably file intellectual property suits. That's my honest answer, that when vested interests are threatened, given the large number of very bogus patents that have been issued and the ability of companies or parasites to file litigation, that will probably be the favorite weapon of choice, which is to say your open source project infringes the following 62 patents.
So we still live under Jack London's iron heel.
Well, I think things are going to get messy. I wish I were more optimistic about this, but anybody who's looked into this understands that it's the patent situation is a ticking time bomb, mainly because, as a matter of policy, the Patent Office started issuing patents on anything, beginning around 1990, basically just saying it's kind of, it's your ticket to litigate, rather than enforcing what I think the legal scholars agree is the proper standard, which is that to get patented, you have to do something that's original and has an inventive step. But the fact is there are tens of thousands of bad software patents, any one of which can be the basis for a lawsuit. And I think, and there's no reform movement in the background kind of gathering power and strength. I think there's going to have to be like a Bhopal level meltdown, and in order to get people's attention around this. And it doesn't matter that it's completely nonsensical. it's kind of almost a Dickensian bleak house kind of, well, this is the law, and these are the patents, and these are the injunctions, and you have to stop, even though it's obvious to anybody, who's done any programming that that thing, it's not worth being patented.
So right now, what can we do? The kids at Stanford and MIT and Harvard who want to collaborate on widgeting on the net, or the kids in the life sciences department who are looking at their DNA, and some asshole in the Amazon went there and patented some gene structures on acai. They're no longer allowed to work on these projects anymore and publish their ideas, be it software or genetic code. They'll be sued. Is that it? Are we screwed in the regime right now? Game over, go home?
Well, oh no, I don't think you go home, but I think you have to be prepared in an open source project if it is one that begins to impinge on the interests of somebody that's entrenched. You have to have a strategy as to what you're going to do in the event that you're threatened with it. And there are a variety of strategies. One is, well, nobody working on this project has any money, and we're not even incorporated, and there's nothing to sue, and so we're just going to do it because chances are we probably won't get sued, or we'll worry. No, I know projects that have that. What does the Apache Foundation do? Brian, let's get a data point here.
The problem with that is they'll get sued privately, and their homes will be taken away and such. What many open source projects do is create these foundations, like OSAF or the Apache Software Foundation, to act as a shield for the activities of the developers and to get the copyright and patent assignments from the contributors as well. So no one can sneak something in and then wait for it to be ubiquitous and then go and sue everyone. Right? So, the whole thing with like SCO and Linux is kind of a red herring, but it is illustrative of what could happen. It is interesting to see that people are basically ignoring it to one degree.
Right. So you can defend yourself, you can ignore it, but unfortunately, we can't just make the problem go away. So I think things are going to have to get a lot worse, and at a certain point, enough people are going to be affected negatively that there will be a reform movement that says the patent system for software has gotten completely out of control. And I hope I'm still around when that happens.
Mitch?
Yeah.
Over here.
Yeah.
I believe that the success of 1.2.3 was because of the singular vision of the user interface. Nice implementation, nice algorithms, but really was your UI. You can disagree, of course. How does one keep a singular vision for user interface for an application done by open source?
Well, there are different styles of leadership and coordination in open source projects. Some are very decentralized and really run by consensus. They tend to be engineering driven. There are other projects that have a central figure who is looked to for leadership and guidance. Linux itself and Brendan Eich at Mozilla. If the project has that style and it's an application, then there's the hope that that person who's providing the leadership can kind of orchestrate a consistent user interface. And that is what we're trying to do. Andy Hertzfeld has been working on this project now as a volunteer for a couple of years. We finally hired a full-time interaction designer. We're at that point, and again, we're not out of the woods yet, but I'm relatively optimistic we will do something interesting and coherent and different as a user interface. Whether people like it, or how much we have to redo after we see what happens with the first generation, I don't know yet. But I think the point that I want to make is that doing user interfaces is not any harder than doing engineering. It's just different and requires smart people with a different skill set. And if you can get them to show up and be part of the project, there's no reason that open source things have to have bad UIs. It's a historical fact that open source started with engineers scratching their own itches. And engineers typically are less sensitive to the nuances of user interface, at least as far as regular users go. So to me, it's a historical explanation. It's not inherent in the form. You get together a different set of folks with a different set of goals. I don't see any reason why there can't be a reasonably satisfactory user interfaces.
Hi,
That's
Mitch.
the hope.
My name's Tamara,
Yeah.
and my question involves innovation potential. You said that risk-taking is constrained by decentralization and consensus issues, and also it may be constrained by a little bit by the legal structure. Can you elaborate a little more on that?
Well, what I meant there was that if you want, I mean, consensus is your friend, except when it's your enemy. You know, people who have run things, I mean, there are different styles of leadership, but there's one style of running things that says the fewer direct orders you have to give, the better. It's much better when decisions sort of come up by agreement or bubble up, because then you have buy-in by the people who are actually doing it. But the limit is sometimes, you know, if you depend entirely on consensus, it's not an atmosphere that's conducive to sort of taking the big leap, to really doing something, you know, different, because it's just too hard to get a group of people to do that. And it's in those cases where you not only have to have somebody or some bodies who are willing to do that, but an organizational structure that supports it. In other words, so if you have a completely kind of consensus-driven organization, somebody could show up and have a great idea, and it could really be the great idea, but they'll just get squashed by the other people. It won't be permitted to happen, and I've seen that. And so if the goal is you know, to innovate, that is going to involve doing things differently and taking risks. And I think the point is you need organizational structures that permit that and that don't squash it. And that is just, it's sometimes hard. There's conflict, and conflict has to be managed. And I think there's a lot of very good practical wisdom in the open source world of getting large groups of people to work together successfully. Not a simple thing, given people's propensities to flame and one thing and the other. And that's been a very significant accomplishment. I'd say the next decade of accomplishment is open source projects with significant innovation, because the projects are willing to take risks. And that means sometimes things are going to fail. That's okay too.
My name is Rob Block. I work for Sun currently, and I've also in the past worked for a software startup. And I have a couple of observations that came up when you had your last slide on about the get rich quick and the dream of software startups. And I guess my first observation is that when you talked about the number of companies that had fairly outlandish valuations, and which are now, a lot of which are practically worthless now, you know, as a result of the internet.com bubble and burst. I guess my first observation is that, as I recall, the majority, if not the vast majority of the companies that went through that cycle were not actually software companies, but were either, to a large extent, media companies or service companies. You know, some of them were software companies, but it was a lot easier to get, you know, vastly overpriced valuations if you were actually not building a product, if you were actually, you know, had a website or getting
well, fair enough.
advertising
Lots of
revenue
different
that went,
categories of companies, many of which were not software. Some of which were. I mean, their software might have been a website, but to me, that's software. Some content.
And my second observation was that for all of the obstacles, if you will, that open source software may have for companies, you know, I guess maybe it definitely raises the bar for what a software startup has to do, you know, with the plethora of open source alternatives or stuff that's available. But I think at the same time, it actually lowers the barrier of entry to for software startups. I mean, for one thing, because of the you know, along with Moore's law and the decreasing cost of equipment, having worked at a software startup and seeing, like, you know, I know that it dramatically reduces the cost infrastructure for a lot of things that in the past companies
I mean, there's so
had
much.
to do. So it definitely works both ways in terms of.
That's right. There's so much good open source out there in terms of your tools or things that you could build on that you can get further with less resources. I mean, we're certainly doing that at OSAF. I mean, I think it would cost, if we had to do this the old way, it just would have cost 5 to 10 times as much, because we're just building on top of so much other stuff. Yes?
Yes, my name is Larry. I work for Veritas. Network security has been a concern, as well as the system security in general. So do you think the open source system is more secure or less secure than as to the proprietary system? Thank you.
Inherently less secure or more secure, or practically? So I'm not a network security expert. My one observation is, I think the idea of security through obscurity has largely been discredited, and that the most trustable systems are the ones that the most people can pound on to see what they're made out of and know how they work. I think that's a very general kind of principle. And so that over the long term, I suspect that the security advantage is going to go to open source. But we'll have to see. Yeah, so let me do that with that. Yeah.
My name is Nicky Wu. Mitch, I want to kind of looking back that a few years ago, I'm sure Microsoft has laughed about the open source. And nowadays, with what you show on the slide saying that open source have a few surprises. So I believe that Microsoft is running a little bit scared right now. And with the product that you go to Fry's, you see around the Red Hat is actually selling next to Microsoft product, which is selling for $149. So I'm trying to get your perception. When do you think open source at least is going to start winning?
When will it start winning? Well, so Microsoft, I mean, they've been very upfront that they consider open source to be the #1 strategic threat. But it depends what segment you look at. I mean, in the server segment, open source is winning. In the what are Apache's numbers for web servers market share? 66%. So it's really a question of when will other sectors enjoy similar growth. I wish I could, for instance, be bullishly optimistic about the desktop market. Like when is Linux going to get significant market share? But we did a study at OSAF, and I think that if Linux has 10% share of the desktop worldwide in 5 years, that would actually be a significant accomplishment. Getting to more than that, I think, is for a whole variety of reasons. That's really the toughest segment is going to be the kind of consumer desktop. But before open source marches into that territory, I think it is likely to achieve very significant successes in other areas. So for instance, there are a lot of corporate applications like call centers where the computing needs are very clear, and where a Linux-based system can do everything that's needed at significantly less cost. And there are, I don't know, a couple of million people who work in call centers. I don't know, they're never around when I call, but they're apparently there are. And so that's what really I expect to see happen, is that on a sort of a market by market basis, there will be increasing penetration. But again, I don't have a crystal ball I don't think there's going to be some like great pole shift, and one day we're all going to be running open source, but it'll just be an increasing factor in the landscape. Yeah.
Hi, Mitch. My name is Abdur Rahman, and I work in the corporate environment, such as HP, and one of the things I've seen that most of the upper-level managers, they shied away from open sources because there's no support. They expect to see a technical support number, or 800 number, or technical support email. So how do you argue to that? What kind of support?
Well, actually, HP has been a corporate leader in selling open source solutions, so it's a little ironic to hear you say that. But what people are doing increasingly is they're selling service contracts on open source software. That's what a significant part of Red Hat's business is, and it's a great opportunity because a certain segment of the enterprise market, they want to have an 800 number, they want certain guaranteed responses, and so that's where you see significant job growth in the open source areas. people doing that if there's a popular product. So that's kind of, I mean, there may be some managers are going to take more convincing than others, but I just see a lot of momentum there. Yeah.
But they never fix it.
Right. So. In the back.
Hi, my name is Banu. My question was, when you see the gold rush of open source literally happening, if you compare it to the Sierras of SourceForge.net, where gold miners like Red Hat would like to invest in projects hidden in these repositories and figure out how to commercially make these products viable. What is stopping investors? Like you said, MySQL got $18 million in investment. That's probably a good sign where VCs have finally realized that pre-existing code developed by such intellectuals can actually be made commercially viable, and that core competence that is lying in these repositories can be taken out and made competitive products out of it. Developers per se are not, they don't have the business acumen that VCs can bring in. Why isn't that a healthy trend?
So I think the nugget there, if I understand what you're saying, is the idea that you could start with an open source code base. Maybe it's something you do yourself in a group. Maybe it starts with something that's on SourceForge, but something that's quite good and underutilized, and you take that and add a wrapper or a layer around it into being a particular solution in the enterprise space or elsewhere. So that model is in its infancy, and I think there's going to be more and more of that as time goes on. I think it hasn't become recognized that there's a repeatable pattern there. You could cite individual instances, MySQL and others, where that's happening. And the sort of diffusion of knowledge and understanding, it is a mysterious thing. One of the things that slows it down is sometimes to do something successfully, you have to have multiple people with very distinct competencies working together. For instance, someone with a great technical competence in sort of lassoing or herding some open source software to actually be usefully deployed. There's a real set of technical skills in doing that. That's one skill set. Another skill set may be a business-oriented skill set of how you would take something like that and actually to get somebody to pay money for it. And people who know how to do that, they're kind of, it's the Brownian motion phase where they're, and you've got to get we saw this in the early days of PCs, of what it took to make any kind of successful personal computer application is you had to have the technical people that knew how to make something work in like a 64 kilobytes of memory, along with a business person who knew how to find some segment that would buy something that ran on an Apple II. And it actually took several years. So I think more of it's going to happen. It's still early. If you see an opportunity. And the other thing is, investors are like sheep. They really, for the most part, do not like to take risks. They are followers. People do not like to pioneer a new segment. It's too risky. And so that's why things sort of nothing happens, and then all of a sudden it explodes because somehow sooner or later you see the first investment in a segment, and then you get, well, the other 6 or 8 or 10 firms all rush in, because once somebody has done it, then it's safe to do. And so there are also a lot of dynamics about investing that come into play as to why things do or don't happen. So be patient. Yeah.
Yeah, my name is Olu, and my interest is in DSP. You said a lot of people made a lot of money, but no value was added to the systems. Do you mean that in terms of new product, optimizing existing system, and how can open source leverage its presence in mitigating against those kind of system errors in the future?
Well, so what I meant by no value added is if you look at whatever that company was doing for which they got the market cap, it turns out that nobody is using that at all for anything, or very few people. There's no economic kind of benefit. I think that lesson has really been learned. We're not going to have, in this generation, another one of those booms. It's going to take a whole generation for people to grow up who didn't go through this, to have the precondition for it. So I don't think that that's what open source is competing against. In fact, what there is, though, is a long, slow process of education, because, as I said when I started out, a lot of the basic ideas about open source are counterintuitive to the way managers are typically trained and typically think, who are risk averse. It's a different kind of model. It's sort of like nobody's in charge and nobody really owns it, and can I really trust it? And until there's a generation of management at all levels that has grown up with a different set of understandings, there's just going to be resistance. It's just going to be, slow. And people who advocate and want to do things with open source, you kind of got to go where the atmosphere is receptive. Otherwise, you're banging your head against the wall. So you got to find who the lead customers are in your particular segment. Yes.
So it's your comments about capitalism and postmodern capitalism and what's going to happen when concentrations of capital meet this kind of new distributed force. We talk about open source in terms of software because the Creation Act is not dependent on a production or distribution act. And open source seems amenable to small groups of people getting together and creating IP and then finding ways of delivering that value because they don't need a manufacturing infrastructure, they don't need a distribution infrastructure. So the economics work pretty well. As things like chemical synthesis, desktop manufacturing, print circuitry with organic polymers on your Epson printer, as those things come in 10, 20 years, whatever it is, do you think the open source model is representative of more than just a change in software as an industry and more indicative of a larger change as distribution becomes bits and manufacturing becomes distributed?
Well, as I said before about Paul Saffo, we all tend to underestimate the long-term effects of changes. And so, to the extent more of, again, the economic value can be crafted in terms of bits moving on wires rather than, assembling and shipping atoms around, that's just, it's just cheaper and easier to duplicate. And so here's the key thing. To what extent can the methodologies of open source actually work in some of these other arenas that you're mentioning? And again, it's outside my expertise. I think there tends to be kind of rampant enthusiasm when people superficially see a similarity of pattern and say, of course, it's inevitable, and they get into a kind of a techno-determinist kind of head. But there's both irresistible forces and immovable objects. And so I don't think we yet know what the immovable objects are in whether, sometimes forest fires tend to hop over barriers, and can open source do that? And sometimes, they cut the big, cut down a big swath of things and they contain the fire. And so it's something I'm really interested in, but what I've seen so far is more speculation than anything else. So we'll have to see.
So just one comment on that.
Yeah.
A place where people have thought about this stuff, speculatively, a lot is in the molecular manufacturing space, where you kind of confront this as a byproduct of success. Right? And the interesting thing to think about is IP there has become one of the dominant issues of discussion, because managing IP is really deriving value.
Right. And to get back to what I was saying before, I think we will have to have some major kind of social crisis that will threaten everything to get on the right track, because the track we're on right now is increasing IP protection. It's the idea that you can own an idea and control what people do with it. That's the kind of Newton's third law opposite and equal reaction to the ability to move bits around and copy them is people are spending enormous amounts of time getting laws passed and trying to enforce them to try to, give people control over this stuff. And they're not going to give up without a fight. And fundamentally, it just doesn't work. It's like every copy protection system ever developed has been defeated typically within 24 hours. This is not stopping people from developing new copy protection systems. It's just a powerful kind of illusion that people are under, but that's the world that we're heading into, of those kinds of struggles of, irresistible forces and immovable objects. So it'll be fun. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Phil. It's more of a comment than a question, but there are some questions here. I work for a company that does make enterprise software, and we're moving big way into open source, particularly for the commodity platform engine stuff. What it does allow us is to innovate around and on top of those. And for example, right now we're working on some software for process management, and we're very excited about something called Open Symphony. We've been working with a proprietary process engine, but for us and our customers, we're finding that just as with Apache and a lot of the other things that used to be high-end engine software that enterprises were paying for, they really don't want to see that is moving down to the commodities. And I'm wondering if that isn't really one of the benefits of open source, is to make very solid, reliable, inexpensive commodity infrastructure, so at a higher level you can make innovation.
Amen. You said it better than I could say it. The only thing I would say, if I were, say, on the board of, if your company were public, is I would be asking, well, how long before it moves further up the stack to where you're adding proprietary value now? Do you think it's defensible? Are there fundamental reasons you think you can stay there, or is open source just going to chase you all the way, to the top of the beanpole? And then where's Jack going to go? So, good now, which is great. I don't have the answer, and I don't think there's just one answer. But that's the kind of the downside that, commodification is really great, except when it hits your profit center. Yes?
I thought I understood what was this open source thing, but now you got me confused at all.
Go a little louder, please.
I have used open source stuff for quite a while, and I'm excited about the products they put out there, but I'm one of those people who prefer to work for money. So, and I think most of the people who do open source one way or another, they work for money too. Like Stallman in the 80s were charging $250 an hour for consulting, as an example, right? So taking your example further, how will this open source work in a society, extending it, right? So for example, all of the wineries will publish their wine recipes, all of the foods will be like Colonel's secret recipe will be public, and everybody will do his stuff. I'm not sure if it makes sense, like from Finance 101, right?
Well, I don't know that that's going to happen. I would say the question is, ask the people who make the wine, who are still going to act in a self-interested kind of way, if they think that it makes sense and they can do something sustaining, publishing their intellectual property. I think the point is, if they can, somebody will, and it will change things. Amateur winemakers collaborating over that. So the world is going to change irrevocably, not because somebody is making a change, but because various parties are going to re-understand their own possibilities and do things in a different way, and there are going to be winners and there are going to be losers. But when you can get the same thing at better quality for less money, society is the winner, because it means that there's more resources available that could go to better education or feeding people or buying things. So there's no hidden hand that is going to do things in a way that somebody comes along and says, you just violated Finance 101. Anything that happens is going to happen because people are making those decisions. So two more?
Two more questions.
Two more, okay. Yeah.
Hi, Mitch. I don't know if this is on or not.
Yes,
My name's Reed. One of your first questions was, how do you compensate the developer of open source?
Right.
And so I recognize there's lots of challenges and there's a few solutions to that. My question is slightly different. How do you motivate an uncompensated developer to work on your project?
Well, what motivates developers? I mean, people have looked into that, and there are a number of factors. Certainly getting paid is one thing, but sometimes people will volunteer on projects because they think it is going to increase their reputation capital, which will increase their ability to get hired since their work product will be out there. Sometimes people want to work on something just because it's fun and they're passionate about it. And so, I mean, again, there's no simple formula, but there are really 1,000 reasons why somebody might work on something. And if you are putting yourself in the position of trying to get other people to work on your thing, you really have to be a student of practical psychology and understand the radically different kinds of motivations that people have, and try to tap into those things. And if you're doing something that's interesting, I mean, programmers actually, it's actually difficult work, and there's a lot of satisfaction in making a contribution to a good product that people actually use. And so many of the paying jobs don't offer enough of that for people if you actually go and talk to them. So one advantage in open source is there are compensating advantages in some of the less tangible types of rewards. At the end of the day, there still has to be some money somewhere for somebody. I mean, but as I tried to argue, it's not that free software, it's not really free, it's just like 1/10 the cost of what people are used to paying. It's just a kind of a different package, a different way of putting things together in terms of jobs. And there are a lot of people who would actually, as long as they don't have to give up their house and can pay their mortgage, are happier to work on something where they feel it's making a difference.
Before we take the final question, one more question, but before the final question, I want to say a couple things. First of all, I want to remind you all of our upcoming next month. Our speaker will be Will Wright, the creator of the Sims family of games, speaking on lessons from game design, what all the rest of us in the world can learn from those at the leading edge of game design. December, our speaker will be John Gage, Chief Researcher at Sun Microsystems, Director of the Science Office at Sun, and the founder of NetDay. And just this morning, Vivo got a phone call from Florence, Italy, from Paul Sappho, saying that he believes he is going to be able to make it as our speaker in January. So we look forward to seeing you there. If you're not already on the mailing list to receive notices for distinguished speaker events and other events that SDForum holds, there is a sign-up sheet out in the lobby on the table there. Put down your name and we'll send you notice of the upcoming events, or you can go to SDForum's website, www.sdforum.org, and sign up there. So with that, I want to thank Mitch very much for your considered thoughts on open source development.
Hey, Sandy.
A lot to
Sandy,
learn.
you
Yes.
forgot the final question.
Well,
No, but you work on, because this now, with this lead up, it's got to be a really great question.
It's not really one question, it's two, and neither one is for you, Mitch. Can I ask you now? Okay.
No. First we get to thank Mitch, because once he answers the final question, everybody's
going to rush for the exits.
and I don't get a chance to thank him for just a terrific presentation this evening. He's given us a lot.
Thank you.
Howdy, Mitch. I have two questions for the audience. Not for you. You can
I'll
sit down now.
That's fine.
The question is, who in this room actually currently works on an open source project? And the second question is, who lives on an open source project? I'm just interested in. So who currently works on an open source project? And who makes a living out of it? Okay, thanks very much.
100%. And I thank you very much.